The day had started like any other. Or at least, that's what I told myself as I walked through the revolving doors of the office, laptop bag slung over my shoulder, coffee still steaming in my hand. I had been there for over 8 years, built my career from the ground up, and had earned the respect of everyone around me. Every late night, every client pitch, every sleepless weekend had led to this. I thought my dedication made me untouchable. I was wrong. By mid-morning, everything changed. An email notification popped up on my screen. I hesitated before opening it, sensing something was off. The subject line read, "Termination notice, immediate effect." My hands shook as I scrolled through the words. No warning, no explanation, no opportunity for discussion. Just a cold, impersonal decree from the new CEO, a man who had stepped into the building just 24 hours earlier, and already thought he could rewrite the rules. I stared at the screen in disbelief, fired, like some expendable piece of office furniture. My blood boiled. I had poured years of my life into this company, and in less time than it took to make a cup of coffee, it had all been stripped away. And yet, as anger flared, I forced myself to take a deep breath. This wasn't the end. Not yet. The next morning, as I sat at a nearby cafe, I couldn't help but watch the office through the floor-to-ceiling windows. That's when it happened. Claire, the CEO's secretary, burst into his office like a storm. Her heels clicked against the marble floors. Her face flushed with fury. Papers flew as she slammed the door behind her. Her voice rang out, shaking the glass walls. At first, I thought she was simply scolding him for a misplaced file or a missed meeting, but the intensity in her eyes told a different story. One I didn't yet understand. I watched, hidden in plain sight, as she unleashed everything she had held back. Contracts left unsigned, accounts mismanaged, confidential communications ignored, every critical detail he had overlooked in his first day on the job. And the CEO? He faltered. For the first time, I saw cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Smugness gave way to panic, arrogance to uncertainty. I realized something in that moment. His confidence was fragile. His authority unearned, and his mistakes, they were my opportunity. Fired or not, I had knowledge, leverage, and patience on my side. Every misstep he made was a thread in the web I could unravel. Every oversight was a seed for the storm I was about to unleash. By the time she stormed out, slamming the office door behind her, I knew the game had begun. I had been dismissed, but I wasn't defeated. I had been underestimated, and that is always the deadliest mistake someone can make. I wouldn't just survive this. I would turn it around. I would expose every flaw, every miscalculation, every betrayal he thought he could bury. And by the time it was over, the man who had fired me on his first day would wish he had never set foot in the office. Because some mistakes aren't just costly, they're fatal. And I had all the pieces, all the knowledge, and all the patience I needed to bring his empire crashing down brick by brick. After the shock of being fired, I spent the rest of the morning in a haze. The office I had once walked through with confidence now felt foreign, almost hostile. My desk, usually cluttered with files and reminders of deadlines conquered, looked empty, stripped of its purpose. My email inbox was still active, yet every notification felt like a taunt. A reminder that my world here had been reduced to nothing more than a terminated employee status. But I wasn't done. Not even close. I knew the company inside and out. Every workflow, every key client, every hidden liability. It was all mapped in my mind like the blueprint of a house I had built brick by brick. The new CEO, in contrast, was blind to it all. He had walked in with confidence, a charming smile, and the arrogance of someone who believed authority was earned overnight. He didn't understand the people, the processes, or the intricate deals that kept the company running. And that ignorance, that was my leverage. The secretary, Claire, was a story of her own. She wasn't just a gatekeeper, she was the company's memory. 10 years in her role had given her a photographic mind for detail, an ear for whispers, and a loyalty to the company that surpassed any individual. Watching her confront the CEO the day after my firing, I realized she had been the first to recognize the cracks he couldn't see. Her fury wasn't random, it was informed, precise, and deadly in its potential. I had to be careful. I couldn't storm back in like a tempest and risk burning every opportunity. Patience was my weapon now. I spent the day walking through familiar halls, talking casually to colleagues, observing the chaos that had begun in the wake of his first missteps. Every whispered complaint, every confused executive, every overlooked deadline was a confirmation that he was unprepared. Every mistake was a thread I could pull. That evening, back at my apartment, I reviewed everything I had saved before my termination. Contracts, emails, performance reports, internal memos. Every document told a story. Mismanaged funds, ignored deadlines, miscommunication that could cost millions. I wasn't just planning to expose incompetence. I was planning to dismantle the illusion of control he had stepped in wielding. But I couldn't do it alone. Claire was the key. She had access, authority, and credibility. More importantly, she knew things I didn't. Back channels, informal agreements, unwritten rules that governed the real power structure. I reached out to her subtly, framing it as concern for the company rather than revenge. She was skeptical, naturally. Most employees feared the new CEO, and even more feared being caught in office politics. But when I shared the first pieces of evidence, documents he had overlooked, deals teetering on collapse, her hesitation melted into resolve. That night, I laid out a mental map. The board meeting in 2 weeks would be my stage, but the preparation had to be meticulous. Every error would need documentation. Every hidden vulnerability would need corroboration. Timing would be crucial. I couldn't rush. I had to wait until the moment was undeniable. I wasn't seeking chaos for chaos's sake. I was orchestrating inevitability. By the time I slept that night, the plan was forming, precise and cold. I would return as a ghost in the system, invisible but omnipotent, using knowledge as my weapon. Every misstep the CEO had made in his first day, every small mistake in judgment, would be amplified until there was no defense, no excuse, and no hiding. The man who had fired me had underestimated the one person who understood the company best, and that mistake would cost him everything. The calm had returned on the surface, but beneath it, a storm was building. And when it hit, no one would escape unscathed. Not him, not the company, not anyone who had assumed that arrogance was a shield. I had been fired, yes, but I was far from powerless. In fact, being underestimated had given me something even more valuable than employment: opportunity. The stage was set. The pieces were in place, and soon the reckoning would begin. The days after my firing were a study in chaos. From the outside, it looked like a normal office buzzing with activity, but behind closed doors, the wheels were wobbling dangerously. The new CEO strutted through the halls with forced confidence, projecting authority he hadn't earned, while the employees whispered about his mistakes in hushed tones. Everyone knew he was out of his depth, and it was only a matter of time before the cracks became chasms. Claire became my unexpected ally. At first, we spoke in whispers, exchanging observations over coffee breaks and brief hallway encounters. She told me about overlooked contracts, missed client communications, and decisions made without consulting anyone who actually knew the work. Every story, every detail she shared, added another thread to the web I was quietly weaving. Meanwhile, the CEO made every mistake possible. He approved a marketing campaign without reviewing the budget. He promised clients deliverables that didn't exist. He signed off on deals without understanding the clauses, leaving the company exposed to massive liability. His arrogance blinded him, and every blunder gave me more ammunition. I could almost see the dominoes lining up, ready to topple. But it wasn't just the CEO's errors. It was his reaction to Claire's storming the day after my firing. Instead of listening, he dismissed her concerns, brushing them off as trivial. He underestimated her intelligence and influence, just as he had underestimated mine. And yet, that miscalculation became the first real advantage in my favor. Claire began gathering evidence quietly, documenting his failures. Each file, each memo, each email became a puzzle piece. From the outside, I remained invisible, a former employee quietly observing from the sidelines. I had to appear disengaged, unbothered, like someone who had moved on, but inside, my mind raced constantly, analyzing patterns, memorizing mistakes, calculating the exact sequence of events that would turn his first days of arrogance into a complete unraveling. I had the knowledge, and I had patience, both far more dangerous than brute force. One afternoon, I received a panicked call from a mid-level manager. A critical deal was at risk because of the CEO's oversight. He had promised a client terms that conflicted with internal agreements, and the client was furious. I felt a rush of grim satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of pressure point I had been waiting for, the beginning of the avalanche. I advised the manager carefully, making sure the fallout would reach the board, and ultimately, the CEO. By now, the tension in the office was palpable. Employees tiptoed around him, wary of another public misstep. Yet he remained oblivious, confident that his charisma would carry him through. Every misjudged email, every missed signature, every forgotten deadline stacked on top of one another. The dominoes were aligned, and I was the quiet hand poised to tip them. Even Claire grew bolder. She began highlighting errors directly to me in whispered updates, pointing out weaknesses I could exploit without her getting caught. Together, we created a network of intelligence that no outsider could detect. The power dynamic was shifting slowly but unmistakably. I had been fired, but I wasn't powerless. I was a strategist behind the scenes, orchestrating a reckoning that was inevitable. By the end of the week, the office felt like a pressure cooker. The CEO's confidence wavered in subtle ways. The way he avoided eye contact with key managers, the way he second-guessed decisions he made moments earlier, the way he relied more and more on Claire without realizing she was quietly documenting everything. His arrogance, which had seemed unshakable on day one, was now becoming his greatest vulnerability. I smiled quietly to myself. Every error he made, every careless decision, every overlooked detail was another thread being pulled in the tapestry of his downfall. He thought firing me had ended the problem. In reality, it had only begun. And the storm I was building, patient, precise, unstoppable, was about to hit. The office had become a minefield. Every hallway, every meeting, every seemingly casual conversation held the potential for exposure or discovery. The CEO's missteps were piling up, and the cracks in his facade were growing wider by the day. But knowing the chaos wasn't enough, I needed leverage. Someone inside who could amplify it. Someone who had both access and influence. That someone was Claire. I approached her cautiously, aware that she had survived under his rule for years and knew how dangerous it could be to speak too loudly. I framed our conversation as concern for the company rather than revenge for myself. At first, she hesitated. Loyalty runs deep, even to the arrogant and undeserving. But when I shared the first pieces of evidence, emails he hadn't read, contracts mishandled, client promises broken, her eyes widened. The spark of outrage ignited in her, and I saw a side of her that had been hidden beneath years of dutiful compliance. "You knew?" she whispered, almost breathless, as if my knowledge validated her suspicions all these years. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice calm. "And now we can do something about it, carefully, strategically." Together we began piecing together the full picture. I had documents, but Claire had the context, the unwritten rules, the informal agreements, the things that no one outside the company could understand. Her information filled the gaps in my knowledge, and suddenly, the scope of his incompetence became undeniable. What looked like minor mistakes in isolation now formed a dangerous pattern. Mismanagement, negligence, arrogance, all converging into a vulnerability so large it could not be ignored. But trust was fragile. I had to test her loyalty, and she had to test mine. I shared selective information first, small victories that confirmed her instincts, letting her see that I wasn't acting recklessly. Each revelation drew her in, cementing an alliance that neither of us could openly declare, but that was impossible to deny. Meanwhile, the CEO continued to misjudge her. He still assumed she would remain a passive observer, a loyal assistant who cleaned up his mistakes without question. But he didn't realize she was documenting everything, quietly filing away emails, noting irregularities, saving his errors for the moment they would matter most. Every confrontation she had with him became more pointed, more calculated, each one a quiet push toward exposure. The more we uncovered, the more personal it became. His arrogance, his dismissiveness, his assumption that firing me ended the threat, it fueled us. I realized betrayal wasn't just about him. It was about the system he thought he controlled. Every decision he made had ramifications he couldn't see, and we were the unseen force that would make him pay. There were moments of tension. Claire would glance nervously at her office door, eyes darting for intruders. I'd have to redirect conversations, mislead curious managers, and ensure nothing tipped him off. One wrong move, one leaked word, and the entire plan could collapse. But each risk only heightened the thrill, each hidden maneuver tightening the web around him. By the end of the week, we had a dossier, complete, organized, undeniable. Each page detailed his failures, each email a thread tying him to mistakes that were no longer forgivable. I had been betrayed by the system when they fired me, but now betrayal became my weapon. Claire had become the ally I needed, and together, we were ready to turn the tables. For the first time since he fired me, I felt calm. Not the false calm of acceptance, but the strategic calm of someone who knows the storm is coming, and is the one controlling its direction. The arrogance that had once blinded him would now be the very reason for his downfall. Every mistake, every lie, every misstep had been meticulously documented, and all that remained was the final act, the boardroom showdown where the truth would no longer be optional. Trust had been a gamble, but in betrayal, we found power. And when the CEO finally realized what had been done, it would be too late. I treated the plan like an audit, methodical, unemotional, impossible to dispute. Revenge for me wasn't about melodrama or vindictive spectacle. It was about clarity. I wanted the facts to speak so loudly that even his bravado would be drowned out by the weight of proof. So I started by turning everything I knew into evidence, and everything Claire knew into context. First, the dossier. I organized every document I'd secretly copied before my termination. Unsigned contracts, budget spreadsheets with odd transfers, redlined emails that never reached the board, client complaints left unanswered. Each file got a cover page. Each cover page listed the consequences of the error in plain terms: lost revenue, legal exposure, reputational damage. Nothing emotional, just numbers and dates and signatures. If someone asked for motive or opinion, I would hand them facts instead. Second, the narrative. Evidence without narrative is noise. Claire's role was crucial here. She provided the informal memory of the company, the unwritten promises to clients, the verbal amendments, the handshakes that never became documented agreements. She showed me where the CEO's decisions directly contradicted those informal but binding understandings. Together we mapped cause and effect. His signature here caused this exposure there. It had to read like a timeline so precise that any reasonable person would see the same pattern. Third, the audience. The board meeting was the obvious arena, but not all board members were equal allies. I quietly identified 3 people who respected process above personality: the audit chair, a senior independent director, and the head of legal. They weren't friends. They were guardians of governance. My goal was to make them uncomfortable enough that they would ask hard questions in public. To do that, I seeded small, verifiable details through indirect channels. An anonymous tip to an internal auditor, a flagged entry in the corporate compliance portal, an offhand email from a fictional vendor pointing to a mismanaged contract. Nothing illegal. Nothing traceable back to me, just the faintest pressure points that would force review. Fourth, the timing. 2 weeks until the quarterly board. Plenty of time to make certain problems look systemic. I arranged for Claire to escalate a routine internal audit at exactly the right moment. I timed a client complaint to hit the customer success inbox 48 hours before the board pack was distributed. I ensured the CFO would be asked to clarify numbers that, on paper, looked tidy but hid contingent liabilities. Each nudge was a pebble on a slope. Once the slope started, momentum would do the rest. Fifth, the optics. Power collapses in public, not in private. I needed the board to see him fumble under lights, to hear questions in the room that made his answers sound thin. For that, I orchestrated a mild leak, a sanitized executive summary sent to a trusted director the morning of the meeting. It contained enough detail to create alarm, but not so much that he could counter it immediately. Panic in governance spreads fast. People instinctively protect the company before they protect a person. That instinct would be my ally. Sixth, the safety nets. I planned for contingencies. If the CEO smelled manipulation and tried to purge files, Claire already had copies safely stored off-site. If legal threatened to block discussion, the audit trail would be held by an external forensic accountant I arranged to consult anonymously. If the media smelled blood, I had a prepared statement that emphasized stewardship and governance, not revenge. This had to look like internal housekeeping gone right, not a personal vendetta. Finally, the psychology. I understood his limits: pride, impatience, theatrical confidence. My strategy was to let those traits work against him, make the problems public, make them simple, force him to answer. People who perform under pressure reveal more than their words. They reveal their process. And his process was sloppy. We rehearsed the sequence in hushed tones: the leak, the flagged audit, the client escalation, the board packet, the morning disclosure. Claire would remain indispensable, the voice of someone who had tried to warn him. I would remain the ghost, unseen but omnipresent in the paperwork, the silent ledger of evidence that could not be wished away. When everything was in place, I felt a cold calm. There's an art to timing a fall. Too early and it's lost, too late and you miss the moment. We had chosen the corner of the ledger where truth could not be debated, only acknowledged. The boardroom would become the mirror that reflected the truth back at him, and there was no mask it could hold. The trap was set. All that remained was to light the fuse. The morning of the board meeting arrived like a storm I could feel in my chest, even from the shadows. I wasn't in the room, but every detail had been orchestrated with precision. Claire moved through the office like a quiet agent, carrying files that contained the cumulative evidence of every misstep the CEO had made in his first days. I watched the live feed on my tablet, heart steady, mind laser-focused. This was the moment where preparation met opportunity. The CEO entered the boardroom with his usual swagger, unaware that every move he had made, every error he had committed, was about to be laid bare. He smiled at familiar faces, greeted directors, and took his seat at the head of the table, certain that control was still his. He had no idea how carefully the pieces had been aligned, how meticulously the dominoes were stacked. The auditors began presenting the findings. At first it seemed innocuous. Minor discrepancies, missing signatures, routine errors. But the pattern emerged quickly. Each example was backed with clear documentation: emails, contracts, financial records, and notes from Claire that highlighted the consequences of every oversight. Every page turned, every slide displayed, stripped away another layer of his perceived competence. The room shifted. Directors exchanged glances, their polite nods replaced by raised eyebrows and subtle murmurs. Questions came, measured but pointed. How is this allowed to happen? Why weren't we informed sooner? Can you explain this liability? The CEO's answers faltered. His voice, once confident, trembled as he grasped for justification, but the evidence was relentless. Numbers, dates, contracts, they didn't lie. His arrogance, once a shield, had become a liability. Claire interjected at a key moment, highlighting the contracts that had been mismanaged, the client communications that had been ignored. She presented them professionally, calmly, like a witness recounting facts rather than delivering accusations. The CEO sputtered, attempting to regain composure. But the board was no longer listening to the man. They were reading the evidence, connecting the dots themselves, and realizing the extent of the mismanagement. Minutes passed like hours. Every failed explanation, every hesitation, every defensive gesture chipped away at his authority. The momentum had shifted entirely. Directors began discussing immediate action. Some whispered about interim leadership. Others questioned whether he could continue. The CEO, once untouchable in his own mind, realized that he was exposed, powerless in the room he had assumed would affirm his dominance. And then came the final blow. A previously unreported client issue, strategically revealed in the pre-meeting briefing I had helped seed through Claire, was laid bare. The board's collective gasp echoed through the room, and the CEO froze. There was no recovery, no charm, No excuses that could bridge the gap between arrogance and accountability. His empire, built on the assumption of authority, unraveled in real time. From my hidden vantage point, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in. Every misstep, every oversight, every instance of underestimating those around him had led to this moment. The boardroom was no longer a place of command for him. It was a theater of reckoning. And in that theater, justice was delivered silently, decisively, and irrefutably. By the time the meeting adjourned, the decision had been made. He would be removed, effective immediately. The dominoes had fallen exactly as planned, and the CEO's first days of arrogance had become the very reason for his downfall. The storm I had set in motion was complete. The aftermath was almost surreal. The office, once buzzing with tension and whispered rumors, now felt oddly still. The new CEO was gone, escorted from the building quietly, his confident stride replaced by a hollow shuffle. No dramatics, no public humiliation, just the quiet satisfaction that the truth had finally spoken louder than arrogance. Claire moved into a more prominent role, her diligence and insight finally recognized. I didn't need a title or acknowledgement. Watching her thrive was reward enough. I had been fired, sidelined, but my influence had never truly left the company. From the shadows, I had shaped the outcome, proving that knowledge and strategy often outweigh position and pride. The board stabilized the company under interim leadership, repairing contracts, addressing clients, and restoring confidence. My fingerprints were invisible to most, but those who knew the inner workings understood the shift. The empire that had seemed unshakable was now balanced on careful, competent stewardship instead of the whims of arrogance. I walked away quietly, leaving the office behind, but carrying a sense of vindication that no dismissal could erase. There was no celebration, no public declaration, just the calm satisfaction of knowing the person who had fired me underestimated the quiet strength of someone he thought powerless. Sometimes, victory doesn't need noise. Sometimes it's measured in stability restored, in power realigned, in the quiet knowledge that justice has been served. And in this case, the lesson had been made clear. Arrogance blinds, while patience, strategy, and careful observation win in the end. Looking back, the lesson was simple, yet profound. Being underestimated is a dangerous mistake. For those who wield power without knowledge, for those who assume authority, guarantees control. I had been dismissed, stripped of title and status, but that only revealed the truth. Influence isn't always tied to a desk, a nameplate, or a corner office. Knowledge, patience, and strategy are far more powerful than pride or arrogance. Claire and I had turned betrayal into an advantage. We didn't act recklessly, and we didn't let emotion dictate our steps. Every move was calculated, every exposure timed. The CEO's downfall wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. In exposing his errors, we protected the company, the employees, and the clients who had been vulnerable under his mismanagement. That in itself was justice. Some might think revenge is loud, dramatic, or messy. But the quiet victories, the ones executed with precision and foresight, leave the deepest mark. He had fired me thinking it was the end of a threat. In reality, it had only been the beginning of a reckoning he never saw coming. The power he had assumed was untouchable, crumbled under its own weight, silently, inevitably. And in that silence, I found clarity. Power isn't about fear, it's about awareness. Control isn't about ego, it's about understanding. And justice, when wielded with patience and insight, doesn't need to shout. It resonates in the consequences. I walked away that day with no need for recognition, no desire for applause. My satisfaction came from knowing the truth had prevailed, and the arrogance that once overshadowed the company had been replaced with accountability and competence. Some victories are quiet, some are subtle, but they leave marks that echo far longer than noise ever could. This is revenge untold, where every misstep meets its reckoning. Don't forget to subscribe.